I'm Michael Baharaeen. This is probably my first time meeting most of you since this is my first time doing a Substack Live. And I've got with me today Dante Chinney of the American Communities Project. I'll let him explain a little bit about that in just a second. But I've known Dante for a couple of years. He's a longtime journalist who's done a lot of coverage of political polling and other things in that realm. Good guy and working on some interesting stuff here with the American Communities Project. So Dante, I'll turn it over to you if you want to just kind of give a quick introduction, who you are, kind of a little bit about your background, and then I think maybe talking just a little bit about how you came to help found the American Communities Project and kind of what it is for folks who are unfamiliar.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I can do that. So just a little bit about myself. I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for a long time now. I'm an old man. So I've been kicking around journalism for 30 plus years now. And the American Communities Project is something that grew out of the work I did. And the idea behind it came from, I did a lot of work where I traveled to different cities around the country and a lot of towns, little places. And like you get to know these places. And if you go to enough of them, you realize that you're in some place in North Carolina and it's really not that different from the place you're in Ohio or the place you're in Iowa or maybe the place in Oregon. And so I started thinking, there has to be a way, because I had some background on data from Pew, there has to be a way to take some of the stuff you do as a journalist kind of inherently when you visit a place and then codify it with data to break the country into different kinds of places. And that's what we did. So what we did is I worked with an academic. I can't do this stuff. It's beyond my pay grade. To use a k-means cluster using 36 different variables to break all the counties in the country into 15 different types of community, types of place. And then we did that originally to look at a presidential election, but you realize once you have built any kind of data, you get at the county level, you see it differently. So we look at economic data this way, cultural data this way. I mean, we have a whole ream of kind of different sets of statistics from consumer research companies that lets us look at where people buy, what they shop, what kind of cars they drive. And those things together, we think, give us a way to try to understand what's happening in the country. The project is based at Michigan State University. I live in DC. I go back and forth between here and Michigan. But what we're doing with it now is trying to understand why the country is kind of pulling apart the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the middle of a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to study what we call American fragmentation, how these different kinds of places are coming apart. And I'll shut up here in a minute. But like the idea that sure, there are blue places and red places, but they're blue and they're red for different reasons. I grew up in Michigan. Washtenaw County and Wayne County sit next to each other. They actually butt each other. They're both very blue. They're both radically different places.
Mm-hmm.
And in our typology, one's a college town and one's a big city. And what does that mean? That means that even if they're both Democratic, they're Democratic for different reasons. When you look at other factors outside of election results, you really kind of see the differences that define the country and kind of why the country's pulled apart a little bit.
Yeah, it's fascinating data for folks who are interested. American Communities Project is a website. It's also on Substack. I recently did a 3-part series just kind of delving into some of their typologies and specifically with a look at the politics of these places. I'm kind of curious. I know when we've talked about this in the past, you mentioned, for some place, obviously, a typology is just kind of a useful tool for understanding, right? But no typology is going to be perfect. And I'm curious, when you guys come across communities that are either have kind of features of multiple community types or that are kind of hard to peg to one specifically, kind of how did you go about, categorizing those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's because obviously there are big cities that have elements. Big cities are really complicated places, right? In fact, that's kind of one of the things that defines them is how diverse and complicated they are. So there are parts of a big city that are like a college town, probably, and there are parts of a big city that are what we call an urban suburb, and there are parts of a big city that are what we call a middle suburb, a little more blue collar. Ultimately, the way we look at it is, look, we have these 15 types. The k-means cluster breaks the counties, the communities into the places they are. And then some places, and you look at the data, you acknowledge they're outliers. So when you write the data, but because we don't just look, this is a system for looking at data and trying to understand what's happening in the country, and that's great. But the other thing about it is, because it's not just a crosstab, These are real places. I can go visit a middle suburb and see what it looks like there. And I can go visit an exurb and see what it looks like there and talk to people and try to understand, getting outside of like data you have or poll, even survey data you have, why people think what they think. Like what are some driving issues behind them? You can go deeper in interviews. Part of that is some places don't, some places are, particularly when you get to big places like these rural middle America type, it's like 600 counties in there. And it's really like small town America. It's small town rural places that aren't driven by agriculture. They're like lots of trade going on inside small communities. um, those places can be very different. And we note that. And like, so sometimes you'll visit a place that's a rural middle America community because it's a little different. Um, but you do have to acknowledge any typology when you do this is like, there's 3,142 roughly counties in the United States, depending on how you categorize a couple things. And taking those 3,100 things and throwing them into 15 sounds like, well, that's crazy. It's like, sure. However, every time we look at election results, we're taking 330 million people or 200 million adults and breaking them into red and blue. And we act like that's valuable in some way. And it
Right.
is. It's a way to keep score. We know who won and who lost. But the idea that everybody's red or everybody's blue for the same reason is ridiculous. The typology we have is not perfect, but we think it does a pretty decent job of trying to understand some of these differences in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that, especially at the county level, I mean, counties vary in size and population and that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Again, we kind of think of this tool the same way that a lot of us election analysts think of election results, which is that you're kind of getting a surface level look and
Yep.
understanding of places generally are, but there are infinitely more granular levels that you can go down to kind of understand a place, and so it's a good tool though. I mean, it's a good kind of starting point. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
what you said that a lot of the kind of the impetus for this project came from this realization that recognition that the country's kind of pulling apart in some ways, and
Yeah.
people who live in different types of communities just live vastly different lives and have
Completely.
and people in other ones. And I'm curious, I mean, maybe you can just talk a little bit about this for the folks who are learning more about this project. How do you guys kind of, obviously you do some journalism on the ground and some reporting, but
Hmm.
how are you kind of getting this information out to the public, so that they can then take the next step of kind of recognizing, oh, this is kind of an interesting, we're a more complicated and diverse country than even we sometimes think about.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's hard, right? I'm going to be honest. Like, the stuff we do, it's funny because you take 3,100 different counties and you sort them into 15 types, and like you take it to a media organization, they'll say like, this is much too complicated. We can't do this. And then you take it to an academic and they'll say like, this is too crude.
Yeah.
So we're kind of straddling this line between being academic and being journalistic. And I do think that like when it comes to trying to reach a lot of people, it's pretty nerdy stuff. Like, I mean, I don't think what we write is nerdy, but I think the idea of like these places are different. They're different because they're driven by these different socioeconomic factors and cultural factors. And like, yeah, what we do is kind of walks a line between sociology, political science, and journalism.
Yeah.
So it makes it hard. I don't know. It makes it hard to do what you got to do with it. But like for us, the data we think is just the starting point. So we have surveys in the field, or like I just wrote a big piece off about inflation because we're working with this group that's using a company that's using large language models to try to understand who people are blaming for inflation. And we're seeing some movement in there now within the types we have that I think there's a big story in there. Like we can see some things happen. Like that's interesting. Like the exurbs and middle suburbs, which are both pretty Trumpy, are kind of moving in a different direction now, and that may say a little something about how the interplay of economics, politics, and culture is affecting those places. But what you really have to do to make it work is you've got to go do the journalistic stuff on the ground. You got to go talk to people. I mean, I will say whenever everybody asks me anything about this, like surveys are excellent for understanding, you know, yes or no, how people feel, or they like Trump or they don't like Trump, or they feel this way about the economy, that way about the economy. That's all great, but they don't ever tell you why. To get the why, you kind of have to go to these places to sit down and have different kinds of conversations with people. And like when we do that, and we go out in the field, we're checking the data to see if it comports with what we're seeing in reality and what we're hearing from people in reality. But the other thing is like the why. The why is what's always missing in any survey data. You have to do a little bit of like, why does this number look the way it is? Well, it could be this, could be this, could be this, or you have people posit experts posit explanations or theories. But like going out and talking to people is the best way to do it. And
Yeah.
so you'll go to a place where you know this place is a really good example of, say, a middle suburb. And like, I know this place is a good example of this. I'm going to talk to those people and ask them what they think. And then you find it works. You go there, and the answers you hear when you go to that place are different than the answers you hear when you go to a different place. And honestly, it's really rewarding. I mean, I've spent a lot of my time now just talking to people around the country and looking at data. And I know the country differently than I ever have. I think I know it better than I ever have. And every year that goes by, I feel like I know it a little better, even though right now the country is very difficult to read.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a key reason why this project is so important, adding a lot of, texture to the broader picture of kinda understanding Americans. For people who are just, tuning in, I'm Michael Baharaeen of the Liberal Patriot. I'm with Dante Jenny of the American Communities Project. Um, you can I think people can find your work is at americancommunities.org.
Yeah, AmericanCommunities.org. And also we have a page on Substack as well, because I guess everybody's on Substack now.
Yep,
So that's where
yep,
they got to be. But like I say, primarily our audience, I do think our audience primarily is like people really interested in politics, academics,
yep,
nerds,
yep.
sociologists,
Great,
which is
great.
cool. Those are my people. It's all fine with me. Yeah.
Well, for folks, if you want to visit americancommunities.org, all of the data that we're talking about is available. I think it's called the Data Clearinghouse. And one of the things that's in there, you sort of have hinted at it, and I'm curious if you can just chat about it a little bit more, is the
Yeah.
survey you all have done, which I think there are two now, and you have a third, I believe, in the field right now. And I know when we were chatting about this recently, you said these are pretty serious undertakings because you're trying to get, I assume, large enough sample sizes in the 15 community types, right? So
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can just kind of talk a little bit about the process of, putting those together and, kind of how that has informed, the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, that's the thanks. I mean, the polling. Look, I think you know this too. Like survey work and polling right now is a little bit, it's in a little bit of a crisis mode, right? Like, how do you do it properly? So when you do what we do, you need to get a statistically significant sample from all these 15 types, right? So you're talking about a pretty big sample. You need 300, 400, and some of the bigger big cities, exurbs, urban suburbs. I think we have 500 in each of those places. So you end
Yep.
up with a sample that's like about you end up with a sample of about 5,000 Americans scattered across these different types, and they're weighted differently to give us national responses. And then we get responses in each one of these community types. Um, the third survey isn't yet in the field, but will soon be in the field. We're literally just putting the final touches on it now and tweaking some of the questions. Um,
I said you've tried to make these questions fairly, not evergreen is not the right word, but not
yeah,
not of the moment, right?
we do not want to do how do you feel about Donald Trump. We
Yep.
do not want to. I mean, I think we may have a how did you vote in there. But we don't want to do that. We don't want to do, like, for instance, like a month ago, somebody was like, you've got to get some stuff in there about the National Guard in Los Angeles. I'm like, man, by the time the survey is released, that's not going to be the way the news cycle is moving right now. That's going to be so far in the rearview mirror. So it is really tricky. I would say that, like, we don't want to do political stuff. That's our goal is to not wade too specifically into politics. We want to be more about culture, economics, maybe social connections. Uh, this next survey, though, and the idea behind this is we put the survey out there, we get all the data, and we write off the survey. And then we see a bunch of stuff in the survey, like, wow, there's something really interesting happening here in the military posts, or wow, there's something really interesting in the state, in the college towns or urban suburbs. Let's figure out a place to go to look at that. And we work with freelancers. We go out ourselves, myself, my colleague Ari Pincus, who helps run the project with me, and then Ray Suarez, who we send off to go to different places around the country. Ray's a friend of mine, and he's a good journalist. It's good to send him out there to do the work. And then we have freelancers. But the idea is to go out into the field and see if what is in the data really is in the field, and the things work together. And we learn a lot from it. This will be the third one, and this one's going to be a little different. The one thing we really learned last year, because we did it in 2024, and we knew this was going to be a problem because this is an election year.
Yep.
And even as we were working out, we're like, Jesus, by the time we release this thing, what are we going to have? Maybe a month or something. Then the election's going to happen. And then is this thing even going to matter? As we're like, well, we got to do it. So we did it. And then we found out, no, it's not going to matter. It's
Yeah.
not a good idea. So we're going to try to stay away from election years. That's our goal. Um, and the point is to do things that aren't about politics, to talk about other things. That
Yeah.
said, this survey, the 2025 survey, there's going to be a lot of stuff about Trump policies and the Trump administration. This isn't a normal administration. These aren't normal policies. These are big, dramatic, moves by the administration, and we're curious to see how people in these different communities respond to them.
Yeah. Maybe stepping back a little bit here, you have a lot of ways of kind of, through this project, whether it's the journalism, the surveys, the data collection, kind of understanding these communities. And I'm just kind of curious, from you or stories that you and your colleagues have kind of talked about, what are some of the, things that you all have learned just in American, it can be about, their politics or kind of how they're sensing things right now vis-a-vis the rest of the country, or kind of their fears, or any, I mean, it's there's so much fascinating data here, and I'm sure you
Yeah.
guys trove of information.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing we've learned, and we've seen it in all, and both the surveys we've done the first 2 years, is when you ask people about their personal lives or about their community and the directions of those things, they actually feel pretty good. And then you broaden it out and say, "Tell me about the country," and then oh, it's terrible. It's just awful. And generally, it's like, do you feel good about the direction of your life? Like 90% in every community, or 80% in every community, at least say, "Yes, I feel pretty good." You ask about the community, about 70% or more in every community say, "I feel pretty good." Then you ask about the country, and it falls to 20%. Okay, so that tells you that a lot of what people are responding to is this perception they're getting of the country through the various media that they look at that may or may not be completely grounded in reality. And the idea that people could be that happy with the direction of their lives and the direction of their communities and that unhappy with the direction of the country really tells you something about just how divided the country is. And so we went out and tested this. We went out to New York City and we talked to people about, are you happy with the direction of your life? Are you happy with the direction of the country? Are you happy with the direction of the community? And then we went up to this small county in the middle of New York called Chenango County. And we asked them the same questions. And we got the same answers in terms of, I am happy with the direction of my life. And then you ask why they're unhappy with the direction of the country, and they're just diametrically opposed.
Yeah.
Right. Like everybody in Newark is unhappy with the direction of the country. This was pre-Trump too. This is during Biden, just about how the country was divided because of Trump. What had Trump done to this country? And then you go out to Chenango County and like, oh, Biden, he's ruining the country. That's why I'm unhappy with the direction of the country. So just the division between how people see their lives and the lives of their communities and the country, that's fascinating. The other thing that just comes out when you talk to people is, look, this is a democracy and people have lives to live. And this idea that like they're knee deep in policy, or they really even at election time, this idea that like they spend a lot of deep time considering, well, I don't know, what about Harris's healthcare policy versus Trump's? I wonder how I feel about that. That's not where their heads are. I mean,
Yeah.
they're busy living their lives. And it can be a little disheartening sometimes, frankly, because you talk to people and they'll say things that aren't correct. And my job is not to correct people. I want to be clear. Like when we go out and do this work, I'm not talking to a politician where he's trying to spin me. When I hear something from somebody and it doesn't sound right to me, my response is not like that's wrong or, I've checked that. My response is always, that's interesting. Why do you think that? Where'd you get that information? Because, the work that we're doing when we go out in the field is to try to go out in the field, come back with a story of what people think and why they think it, not try to correct anybody's points of view. And there was one other thing we found in the second poll we did, which we're going to do in this new poll too. We had a series of true false questions, just factuals. What do people know? And in every community, we asked 9 questions, true false questions. In every community, the majority was wrong, except on 2. They were right. We asked them. One of the questions was, is inflation at or near like record levels, or it's above normal levels for the last 30 or 40 years or something? Obviously, the answer is true, and they said it was true. Is illegal immigration across the border at or near an all-time high? It was at the time, so that was true. But these other questions, and they got those right. These other questions, like, is there an epidemic of child abductions in the United States? And everybody's, yes, there is. And it's like, no, there isn't. The interesting thing when you get in there, we were trying to understand what's happening with this data. And the thing that's really clear when you look at it is when you give somebody a true false statement in this way, they will choose the negative response. That is the nature of the country right now. So is there an epidemic of child abductions? Yes, of course there is. Everything's terrible right now. And it's really disappointing. We have a whole nother set of questions in this next poll, some of them more related on things like the big beautiful bill and trying to understand like what have been the impacts of the Trump administration, just to get a sense of how much they're aware of like factually what's going on, and I'm fascinated to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's really the thing about the true false questions. I mean, I think it seems indicative to me of the fact that, people's kind of faith in their leaders, their trust in one another are at pretty low levels
Yeah.
right now. Which I mean, that's backed up by a lot of other data. I mean, I guess I'm curious, kind of in light of that, have you heard anything, or is there any like conversations that kind of have stuck out memorably of people who something that kind of gave you a little bit of hope, or maybe who themselves kind of felt like, well, things are bad right now, and so, they weren't going to deny that, but they were, still hopeful themselves about the future. I'm kind of curious
Yeah.
that bad right now with most people you talk.
Yeah, I mean, we do hear more from people. There is still hope for the future. That part of America, that part of kind of the American psyche is still there. The idea that if things will be better tomorrow, but there's a lot of concern that like
Mm,
it's not going to be as good for my kids as it was for me. Um, I when I try to understand why people feel the way they do about this, why they feel as negative as they do, I just feel like they get trapped in media echo chambers, whatever you are. If you're on the left, you're seeing stuff on the left that's largely telling you, if you're in social media, it's designed to get a response out of you. So it's going to tell you about terrible things that are happening. And maybe you want to know that stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that. You should know that stuff. But I'm saying that's not the whole story. And the same thing is true on the right. They're told that, oh, look at this horrible, they'll pull out single examples. Say, look at this thing. Look at how awful it is. It's like, well, that did happen. But like, that's not really the whole story. I mean, if you were to ask me, like, there's always this question about like the problems in the country and whether they're driven by, bad actors doing bad things or bad people, right? Which there are definitely some, right? There definitely are. But like when you go out and you look at what's happening in the country, so much is just driven by systems being poorly designed or people trying to do the right thing and just getting it wrong. And the thing that I think would really help the country that's not there right now, there's this talk about the lack of local news, which is really true. The local news infrastructure has collapsed. That's not very good. But the thing that's missing even more than that is context. So the idea of like where you live and what's happening in your community, some people actually have a better idea of that than you think they do. They're really good. But understanding how that is or isn't normal, it's like, like I can't believe like, school enrollment's dropping where I live. It's like that's actually a national problem. Like, when you talk about the being able to see it in a broader context would make them understand the problem in a more systemic way, and they can't really do that because it's not the way they see it. They know what they know about the specific things they know, but it's much harder for them to draw it out to a larger context and larger meaning, and that means it's harder for them to kind of really grasp the bigger picture of what's happening, and that's
Yeah.
disconcerting, you know.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, I think that's something that I've noticed as well in the work that I do is, um, a lot of folks know their worldview is often predicated on kind of what their immediate, surroundings are like, and at least material surroundings, and then the rest
Yep.
of it is filtered in from social media, from cable news, and these other ways of distorting. Which is again, I think a big reason why I think projects like this are so valuable. Just from a point of getting folks to kind of take a step back and try to kind of understand their fellow Americans. I think I believe you wrote a book before you launched this project that was kind of it had a slightly different
Yeah.
apology system, and I'm kind of curious, even from that far back. I don't remember what year it came out, but
Yep.
some of these same you were grappling with some of these same questions, or even hearing about some of these same things from people you were talking to as far back as then.
Yeah, I mean, it was the book was Our Patchwork Nation. It was an earlier iteration of this. Kind of was done a different way with working with a different academic partner, but it was the same concept.
Yeah,
Um, the interesting thing about that was the book came out in 2010, so I watched the recession happen in real time,
that's
and that
right.
was absolutely fascinating. Fascinating. Like I was going back to these places over the course of 2 years. I watched this community in Colorado where they were sure they weren't going to get hit by anything. I watched the whole thing collapse. It was, it's heartbreaking, but it's fascinating because it is exactly what you say. Like you don't know anything beyond the world you live in, like what you see every day. So the assumption is, as it is for most people, like this is the way things are, this is the way things are going to stay. Like that won't happen here. Like they thought they were going to be immune from what was happening with the recession. It was the very early stages. So they didn't know how deep it was, but it was like people here on have so much money that won't affect them.
Mm.
And then as time went by, you watch the whole thing kind of, like pull apart. I mean, the big lesson out of that and this, there are many things have changed. I mean, the things that some of the things people believe now they'll say to you is they're a little surprising. I do think that like what's happened with the web and the internet and social media and people just wandering down paths, like different paths, has led them to believe some things that are just like that's not true. But
Yeah.
like it's interesting that you think that. But the thing that did come out of that still is true is the thing you just said, like where you live and like your interactions every day and who you see and like the businesses in your area, these things have just a massive impact on how you see the country. And like, but you're right, it's that, and increasingly, it used to be that and the national news, right? Or some kind of news source would fill in your understanding of what the world looks like. But now you have that plus this kind of self-selected social media direction that, and you put those things together, and it's made reality it's slippier, much more slippery, and it's harder when you go to these places to. The hardest thing we have, and I think right now in this country, is getting people to agree on a common, just accepted reality.
Yeah.
It's increasingly becoming a problem, and I'm not sure what the answer is for it.
Yeah. Maybe tying just a couple of these threads together, since you've been, kind of doing this work in some capacity for well over a decade now.
Yeah.
What yes, I'm curious about kind of the shifts and the changes that you've seen in some of these community types. I can't quite remember all the exact communities from the Patrick Nation, but I assume there's a decent amount of overlap.
Mhm.
Uh, and I'm specifically curious. I mean, we talked about how today there is this problem of trust and fear and a lot
Mm.
of this. Um, I think folks often will kind of start that at the beginning. They'll point the beginning of that around the time that Trump was elected. But I actually wonder, and since you kind of were reporting on this stuff back during the financial crisis, how much you sort of attribute what happened back then to kind of what we're seeing today, where I mean, I kind of read it as that was when especially post Iraq War and then right
Yeah.
after the Wall Street bailouts, that's when you started to have this real crisis of expertise and faith in authorities. So I'm curious, just kind of if you've seen something similar in informing where we are today, and kind of how you've seen that play out.
Yeah, I would say it's a really good way of lack of faith and expertise has just grown.
Yeah,
And it's remarkable how much it's grown, and it's a little, again, it's disconcerting. It's troubling, because people will say things to you sometimes that are. I have look. We did some interviews a couple of years ago. We talked to people about guns, and because we wanted to talk to people in Detroit about guns, about how they feel about guns, and then we went up to the middle of Michigan, kind of way out, Osceola County, rural, nothing there, and asked them what they thought about guns. And we talked to them, and there were some more similarities than you might have thought, but there were definite differences. But when we were out there in Osceola, several people had said to me that like this is a really special county because the sheriff here has ultimate control of everything. And I'm like, I don't understand. Like multiple people mentioned this to me. Like, if the FBI came here, they would have to do whatever the sheriff said, which
huh.
obviously is not true. It's
Yeah,
just not true. But but it's like interesting. So how does that work? And like asking them to explain it. And that is part of they live in that community, and that's part of the story of that community is that the sheriff has told this story. And it's really disappointing because it's not even a question of expertise. It's just a question of like if you use like it's look, I don't want to. I'm not here to insult people, okay? But like I'm in rural Michigan. There's a lot of Michigans in Michigan. Wayne County, where Detroit is very different than Osceola County, right? So is Washtenaw and Hingham and Kent. These are all very different places. But like if what they were saying was true, basically they seem to be saying that their county sheriff determines what the law is there, which to some extent, obviously, what they choose to enforce and not enforce, there may be some truth to that. But like to take it to the level they did, it was like, well, you all, I mean, this is a community where they're, not huge fans of Detroit, kind of scared of Detroit. And it's just like, well, if that were true, that means if you went to Detroit, you'd have to live under the law of Detroit, whatever that sheriff said the law was, which again, like maybe around the fringes we could talk about what gets enforced and what doesn't. But like it just didn't make sense. And that stuff, that I don't ever remember hearing stuff like that when I first started doing this project. And I feel like, and you hear it on the left too, but like it arises the communities, like the communities that lean left in the work we do are like big cities, urban suburbs, college towns, African American South. These are kind of big, diverse, complicated places where a lot of people with college degrees, particularly the first three. Um, and these other communities, they see the world very differently, and that's always been the case, I think. But absent like a national nightly newscast or a national kind of, I don't know, somebody just saying what the facts are and what the truth is, things have definitely that stuff and distrust of authorities, distrust of expertise, and the idea that like no, I know what's really going on here. I did my own research, or it's different here. Is that stuff gets that's much different than it used to be, because that's like, when I first did Patchwork Nation, that's like 17, 18 years now.
Yeah.
Countries changed. It's hard to believe, like but that's a lot of change in that time, like a lot.
Yeah. 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 I know we were talking just before joining Substack Live, just kind of about the state of journalism right now, especially local journalism, and how it's just kind of been gutted. And really, I mean, in some ways, we've seen sort of the democratization of media.
Yeah.
We're on Substack Live right now, and we kind of control the
Yep.
platform to put out there what we want to write, as does everybody. But I think, and while there are some advantages to that, obviously it's kind of come at the expense of a shared reality and the effects. I think one more thing I wanted to just kind of touch on before we wrap up is, I know you guys have a documentary in the works, and curious if you can just fill in the good folks who are watching about kind of what you all are looking at and hoping to learn from that.
Yeah, well, I'm actually taking off for Michigan tomorrow to work on this. It's a grad student I work with at Michigan State who is a real star. And we had this idea of looking at the 20-year reunion of this high school in kind of exurban Detroit, Pinckney, Michigan, which is between Livingston County, kind of between Detroit and Ann Arbor and Lansing. And
Hmm.
it used to be much more rural. It's kind of seen a lot of development. And what we're doing is the 20-year reunion is Friday. And we've spent the last week before this meeting with three different people who graduated, same graduating class. They moved to very different communities. And I will say, like, you talk about
All
things
in
you
the
learn.
Detroit area or
No.
around.
So one moved up to like metropolitan Flint, one moved down to Ohio, near Dayton, and then one's out in Las Vegas.
Wow.
Yeah, and their lives could not be more different. Like, absolutely fascinating. Just like there's a lot. We talk a lot about the American experience, and like, you do work like this, and you go talk to these people, the same graduating class, same high school. They all knew each other, not super well, but enough, and their lives couldn't be more different. The American experience, such as it is like so vast and varied and complicated. It's hard to get your arms around. So we're going to go to the reunion on Friday night. We're going to meet up with all of them again before, talk to them after, and then my Sonia, this grad student, is going to have to do a lot of editing. But the work's fascinating. The interviews have been absolutely fascinating, and like
Yeah.
we've learned so much. It's super interesting work.
Anything you can kind of tease before people try and go see the whole thing?
um, The one thing I would say is the woman that we talked to in Dayton, Ohio, she's trying to move back to Michigan now. She worked for a company. That company moved to Texas. She was okay being in Ohio, but her family's still in Michigan. Texas is too far.
Hmm.
Um, and the interesting thing was like Pinckney is pretty um, monochromatic, like undiverse, right? It's racially and ethnically, at least. It's a little more diverse economically, but really not very diverse racially and ethnically. And the interesting thing was hearing from her about like the experience. She's got three kids, and the experience there of growing up in a more diverse environment and how valuable she thought it was something. I mean, not that I didn't know her at all. I didn't know who she was, but like she had a good childhood growing up in Pinckney. But she thought like, wow, the value these kids are having growing up in this environment where their kids don't all look like them,
Yeah.
she thought was really valuable. And I thought that was a really interesting part of the story. And their lives have just they do very different things. Their careers are radically different. Their homes are radically different. It's just super interesting stuff.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is the next evolution of the project is kind of finding people who have moved from one community type to the other and doing a whole quantitative analysis of.
Yeah,
Uh,
I will say, like for the work we do at the American Communities Project, they're each in different community types, different types of community, and they're perfect fits. I didn't even realize it until we were in Las Vegas and we were doing the third interview. I'm like, oh my god, these people all
yeah,
line up really perfectly with the place they live. Like the lessons that I thought they would take from living there, how different these places are, super fascinating.
yeah. Well, that might be a good place for us to end on. Thank you again, Dante, for joining and for everybody who tuned in. We will post the full thing after we end here. And folks, as a reminder, Dante's work is at the American Communities Project. You can find them on Substack and at AmericanCommunities.org. Dante, thanks again for joining, and we'll see everybody. Well,
And thanks for your good work, man. I mean, this only came out because I saw you were doing some writing off the types. I'm like, oh man, we should have a conversation.
yeah.
So thank you. This has been good.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So everybody, please go check it out and have a great afternoon. We'll see y'all.
See you now.